The hidden compartment had been built with 16 separate latches, and Theresa Hawkins had no intention of revealing a single one of them. Deputy George Barnett stood in her workshop with his hat in his hands and murder in his eyes, and she met his gaze without flinching because she had faced worse men than him and survived every one of them. The workshop smelled of sawdust and linseed oil and the ghost of her dead husband's ambition, and the massive roll-top desk that sat against the far wall was the most dangerous object in the county of Crockett, Texas, and George Barnett knew it. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said, and his voice was low and controlled in the way that told her he was barely keeping something enormous leashed inside himself. "I am asking you one more time. Open the compartment. And I am telling you one more time, Deputy." She set down her chisel with a precise, deliberate click against the workbench. "No." The afternoon sun came through the single high window and turned the sawdust in the air to gold, and in that suspended, breathless moment, Theresa understood that something irreversible was about to happen between them. The compartment held the evidence that could hang two men and free one innocent. It held her husband's darkest secrets. It held the deed that could take her land, and it held a letter she had never meant for anyone else to read. George Barnett took one step toward her, and she picked the chisel back up. "You come one step closer without a court order," she said quietly, "and I will tell Judge Halloran exactly what you said to me 4 years ago at the Crockett County Fair, before you had that badge and before I had that ring, and we will see who loses more." He stopped. His jaw tightened. Something moved across his face that she could not entirely name, some combination of fury and wounded recognition, and underneath it all, a terrible, helpless admiration. "Theresa," he said, and her name in his mouth after 3 years of formal address was like a door swinging open on a dark room. She did not let herself react to it. She was a widow of 31 years who had built every cabinet in this house with her own 2 hands, who had designed and installed 17 locking mechanisms in this workshop alone, who had once spent 3 days in a blizzard repairing a wagon wheel by herself because there was no one else coming. She was not a woman who reacted. "You will get your warrant, Deputy Barnett," she said, "or you will get nothing. Now I suggest you leave before I lose what remains of my patience." He left. But she stood at the window and watched him ride away on that big gray horse of his, and she pressed one hand flat against the cool glass, and she thought about the way he had said her name, and she was very afraid of what was coming. She had been building things in secret her whole life. She was about to learn that you cannot hide everything forever. The year was 1882, and the town of Seraphina's Creek, Texas, was the kind of place that looked quiet from the outside and was quietly destroying itself from within. Theresa had come to Seraphina's Creek 12 years earlier as the 18-year-old bride of Arthur Hawkins, a man 20 years her senior who had made his money in timber speculation, and who had needed a wife the way a business needed a bookkeeper, practically and without sentiment. She had not been unhappy, exactly. Arthur had respected her intelligence in the careful, limited way that men of his generation respected female intelligence, which was to say he had marveled at it from a safe distance and never once truly listened to what it was telling him. He had taught her the furniture trade by accident, by leaving her alone with his workshop and his tools for days at a time while he traveled for business, and she had discovered in those long, quiet, solitary hours that she had a genius for it. Not just competence, genius. The kind that announces itself quietly, without ceremony, in the private moment when a piece of wood fits exactly where you knew it would, when a mechanism you designed in your head translates perfectly to reality, when you understand with absolute certainty that you can make anything you can imagine. She had built her first hidden compartment at age 19, inside a cedar chest she was making for a neighbor's wedding gift. She had done it because she could, because the geometric problem of it delighted her, and because she had realized even then that there were things a woman needed to keep secret in this world, and the world was not inclined to make that easy for her. By the time Arthur died of a fever 3 years ago, she had built hidden compartments into nearly every significant piece of furniture in Seraphina's Creek, from the mayor's law library to the hotel's front desk to the vestry chest in the First Methodist Church. She was the best furniture maker in 4 counties, and she was the only one who knew where every secret space was hidden. Arthur's death had freed her in ways she was not entirely comfortable acknowledging. He had left her the house, the workshop, and enough debt that she had spent the first year after his death working 14-hour days to stay solvent. What he had also left her, though she had not known it at the time, were his secrets. And his secrets were the kind that got people killed. George Barnett had arrived in Seraphina's Creek 8 months after Arthur's death, appointed deputy by Sheriff Clyde Oakes, who was a decent man stretched thin by a county that had grown faster than his ability to police it. George was 33 years old, formerly a Texas Ranger, and he came with a reputation for being methodical, incorruptible, and completely relentless when he thought he was right. He had dark hair going gray at the temples from years of sun and wind, a jaw like something carved from a more serious stone than other men's jaws, and hands that told the whole story of his life, broad and scarred and rough and unmistakably capable. Theresa had disliked him on sight. This was because she recognized something in him immediately, the same quality she had in herself, the absolute certainty that the world worked best when you understood it completely, which made being wrong a more personal catastrophe than it was for ordinary people. They had not been friends. They had been something more uncomfortable than that, 2 people who occupied the same small town and were aware of each other with an intensity that neither of them chose and neither of them could quite justify. The first time George Barnett had come to her workshop officially, it was to ask about a cabinet she had made for the now-deceased Carl Reuter, who had been found with a bullet in him on the road to Abilene. Someone had told him she built things for Carl, and he wanted to know what she knew. She had told him precisely what she knew about Carl Reuter, which was that he had commissioned a writing desk with a locking drawer in the spring of 1881, and had been surprised by the quality of the lock. She had told him nothing about what Arthur had told her, drunk and delirious in his last fever days, about Carl Reuter and the Danvers land deal, and the 2 men who were still very much alive and very much would prefer that no one ever looked too closely at certain documents. She had not lied to George Barnett. She had simply not told him the whole truth, which was different, and which she had been doing since she was old enough to understand that the whole truth was frequently a luxury that women in her position could not afford. The second time George Barnett came to her workshop, it was to buy a desk for the sheriff's office. He had looked at her work with the focused attention of a man who genuinely understood craftsmanship, had run his fingers along the dovetail joints with an appreciation that was so unself-conscious it had startled her, and had said, "Who taught you this?" "No one," she had said. "I taught myself." He had looked at her then with something that wasn't quite skepticism and wasn't quite belief, but was somewhere in between, and she had found it profoundly annoying. "You taught yourself precision joinery and dovetailing," he said. "I taught myself everything," she said. "I had good tools and plenty of time." He had bought the desk. He had paid full price without attempting to negotiate, which almost no one did. And he had said on his way out the door, "Mrs. Hawkins, if you ever need anything, you know where the office is." She had not been sure what to do with that. She had put it away in a compartment of her own devising and latched it shut. The third time George Barnett came to her workshop, it was the encounter that had initiated everything that followed, and it had begun with the worst possible piece of news. He had arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October with his hat on straight and his face professionally blank, which she had already learned meant he was about to deliver something difficult. She had been in the middle of fitting a tambour to a roll-top desk, a technically demanding task that required her complete concentration, and she had not looked up when he knocked. "Give me 3 minutes," she said. He gave her 3 minutes. She finished the tambour fitting. She stood back, assessed it, saw that the tension was perfect, and only then turned to face him. "There's been a development," he said, "in the Reuter case. I need to ask you some questions about your husband." She felt the particular coldness that came with the confirmation of something you had feared but pretended not to expect. "All right," she said. "We have a man in custody. A man who says Arthur Hawkins was involved in a land fraud scheme that got 3 people killed. He says there's documentation. He says it's hidden." He watched her face with the careful attention of someone who missed nothing. "He says you would know where it is." "Who is the man in custody?" she asked. "I'm not at liberty to say at this point." "Then I'm not at liberty to confirm or deny anything," she said. "You will understand that I have certain interests to protect, Deputy. And until I know more about what you're claiming and who is making the claim, I have nothing useful to tell you." He had left again, and Theresa had stood very still for a long time in the silence of her workshop. And then she had gone to the roll-top desk she was making for a private commission, which was not just a desk, and she had checked every one of its 16 latches, and she had thought very hard about what she was going to do. The man in custody, she learned that evening through the reliable intelligence network that was Seraphina's Creek's social life, was a man named Emmett Cole, who had been Arthur's business associate and silent partner for years, and who was currently charged with the murder of Carl Reuter. Emmett Cole was not guilty of that particular murder. Theresa knew this because she knew who was guilty, which was a man named Rafe Danvers, who was the son of the county's largest landowner, and who had killed Carl Reuter because Carl had been about to go to the law with evidence of the land fraud that the Danvers family had orchestrated, with Arthur Hawkins as their inside man. Arthur. Her Arthur, with his careful respect and his absence and his secrets. The documentation that proved all of this was inside the roll-top desk, hidden in the compartment that Theresa had built and that only she could open. Arthur had put the documents there himself in his last weeks, had told her in his fever that there was something important in the desk in the workshop, had not lived long enough to tell her what to do about it. She had found the documents 2 weeks after his funeral. She had spent the 3 years since then trying to determine what to do about them, because doing anything about them meant exposing Arthur, meant potentially losing the property she had worked herself nearly to death to keep, and meant making herself a target for Rafe Danvers, who was not a man who tolerated threats to his safety. Now Emmett Cole was going to hang for a murder he did not commit, and George Barnett was going to keep coming back to her workshop, and she was running out of time to be neutral. The morning after George Barnett's second official visit, the one where he had demanded she open the compartment, Theresa did something she had not done since Arthur's death. She opened the roll-top desk herself, and she read every document in the hidden compartment from beginning to end. There were 7 documents. 3 were letters from Rafe Danvers to Arthur Hawkins detailing the financial arrangements of the land fraud scheme, in which they had used forged surveys and bribed officials to claim land that belonged to 3 homesteading families, the Cruzes, the Abernathys, and old Emil Schreiber, who had come from Germany with his wife and 2 sons, and had built a farm that Rafe Danvers wanted for the water rights. The Cruz family had been driven off their land by threats. The Abernathys had accepted a buyout that was a fraction of true value under pressure they hadn't understood was manufactured. Emil Schreiber had fought back, and then Emil Schreiber had died in what was officially an accident, and his family had scattered. Theresa read about Emil Schreiber and felt sick in a way that was not just grief but was also guilt, because she had lived with Arthur for 12 years and had not known, had not seen this in him, had trusted that his morality was approximately equal to his outward presentation, and she had been wrong. The 4th document was a deed, the original deed to the parcel of land now called the Danvers North Range, with the Schreiber name still on it. The 5th was a letter from Carl Reuter to Arthur, dated 18 months before Carl's death, saying that he could not continue to keep quiet about what had happened to the Schreiber family and that something had to be done. The sixth was Arthur's reply, which she had not expected to find, in which he had told Carl to be patient and that he was working on a way to make things right. She stared at this letter for a long time. Arthur, at the end, had been trying to make things right. He had not known how, and he had died before he could, but he had been trying. The seventh document was the one that changed everything. It was a full signed confession, in Arthur's handwriting, dated 2 weeks before his death, naming Rafe Danvers as the architect of the entire scheme, naming himself as an accomplice, describing in precise detail exactly how the Schraber land had been taken and exactly who had benefited. It named Carl Reuter as a reluctant participant who had later tried to extract himself. It cleared Emmett Cole of any involvement in the fraud. It was, in short, everything George Barnett needed to free an innocent man and destroy a guilty one. Arthur had meant for this to be found. He had built his own compartment inside her compartment, had trusted her to eventually do what he could not, and the betrayal and the tenderness of this simultaneously nearly broke her. She locked the desk back up, all 16 latches. She sat down on the workbench stool and stared at the wall for a very long time. Then she picked up her tools and went back to work, because she thought better when her hands were occupied, and she had a great deal of thinking to do. The problem was not whether to give George Barnett the documents. That decision had effectively already been made. An innocent man was in jail, a guilty one was still free, and she had the evidence to correct both of these situations. She was her mother's daughter, and her mother had raised her to know the difference between what was convenient and what was right. The problem was how to give George Barnett the documents without losing everything she had spent 3 years building. The land was the central danger. The documents exposed the fraud, but they also exposed Arthur's part in it, which meant there would be a legal question about whether property held jointly by Arthur Hawkins and his heirs was subject to forfeiture or claims by the defrauded parties. She was not a lawyer. She needed a lawyer, and the only lawyer in Seraphina's Creek she trusted was Samuel Bright, who was an honest man and a careful one, and who had the misfortune of also being Rafe Danvers's legal counsel in about half his business dealings. She could not go to Samuel Bright. She could go directly to George Barnett. But if she did, she would be handing him the evidence without any protection for herself, and George Barnett, whatever she thought of his jaw and his hands and the way he had said her name the previous afternoon, was a law officer first, and law officers had obligations that superseded personal considerations. Unless. She turned the idea over very carefully, the way she turned a piece of wood in her hands before cutting, feeling for the grain, feeling for where it wanted to go. Unless she opened the compartment herself, on her own terms, in front of a witness of her choosing, with conditions she set, in a manner that gave her some control over what came next. She needed to understand George Barnett well enough to know whether he could be trusted to honor conditions, and she needed to understand it very soon, because Emmett Cole's trial was in 11 days. She had been studying George Barnett for 8 months with the careful, methodical attention she gave to everything. She had noticed things about him that she suspected he would be surprised to know anyone had noticed. She had noticed that he was unfailingly decent to people who had no power, and precisely as formal with the powerful as courtesy required, but no more. She had noticed that he had twice refused bribes that she had happened to overhear being offered. She had noticed that he kept a book in his coat pocket, always the same size and shape, and that when things were difficult, he sometimes stood outside and read a few pages of it before going back inside. She had noticed that he never lied, not even in the small social ways that made ordinary life run more smoothly, which made him difficult in company but trustworthy in a crisis. She had also noticed, with the part of herself she preferred to keep locked away from professional consideration, that he was a profoundly attractive man in a way that had nothing to do with conventional good looks and everything to do with the quality of his attention, the way he was completely present wherever he happened to be. She had noticed it and she had set it aside, and she had continued to notice it despite setting it aside, which was its own kind of problem. The following morning, before the rest of the town was awake, she walked to the sheriff's office. It was 5:30 in the morning and the sky was still a deep burning purple at the edges and the street was empty and cold. She knocked twice on the office door. He opened it almost immediately, which meant he had been awake, which meant he had also been lying awake thinking about the previous afternoon. He was in shirt sleeves, no vest, no jacket, his hair not yet combed, and she had never seen him anything less than completely composed, and this version of him, still and slightly raw-looking in the early dark, affected her more than she was prepared for. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said, and there was something in it that was not quite the careful formality he usually deployed. It was almost relief. "I have a proposal," she said. "May I come in?" He stood back from the door. She came in. The office was small and smelled of coffee and wood smoke and papers. She did not sit down. She stood in the center of the room and looked at him directly. "I know what is in the desk," she said. "I have known for 3 years. I am prepared to give you what you need to free Emmett Cole and charge Rafe Danvers, but I have conditions." He was very still. "What conditions?" "First, before we go to the desk, you sit down with me and tell me exactly what your legal position is on property held by the estate of a man who is named in a fraud confession. Not what it would be convenient for you to claim, not what gives you the most flexibility. The actual legal position, as you understand it." He went to his desk and sat down, and he looked at her for a moment, and then he picked up a pen, found a piece of paper, and said, "The actual legal position as I understand it." He told her. It took 20 minutes. He was thorough and he was honest, and twice he said things that were not advantageous to the prosecution's case, and he said them anyway, and she marked those moments carefully in her mind because they told her exactly what she had needed to know about him. "Second condition," she said when he finished. "I open the compartment, no one else. The documents are found with me present on my terms. I tell you how many there are and what they contain before you touch them." "Agreed." Third condition. "The deed to the Schraber land goes to whatever family can be located. This is not negotiable. My husband participated in the theft of that land, and I will not benefit from it." He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. "Mrs. Hawkins, that has nothing to do with the criminal investigation." "I know it has nothing to do with the criminal investigation. It has to do with what is right. I'm not asking you to do it officially. I am telling you that this is what will happen with or without your involvement." A long pause. Then, "The Schraber boys are in San Antonio. There is a younger one, about 12 years old now, who I understand is with an aunt." "How do you know that?" "Because I have been looking into the Schraber case independently for 4 months," he said quietly. "I thought there was something wrong about how Emil Schraber died. I have not been able to prove it until now." She stared at him. He had been investigating the same thing from the other direction for 4 months. She had been sitting on the evidence that would have answered his questions, and he had been looking for the same answers she had. The injustice that had been done to that family sat between them in the small room like something physical. "All right," she said. "Then we want the same thing." "Yes," he said. "I think we do." She set her third condition, which was that when this was over, when Danvers was charged and Cole was freed, no one outside the courtroom needed to know the specific details of Arthur's confession. The public record would show that documents were found in the estate. The nature of Arthur's late cooperation could remain, if not a secret, then at least a quiet footnote. "I can't promise you that," he said. "I'm sorry. I can try to limit what becomes public, but I cannot make you that promise." "I know," she said. "I just needed you to understand what it costs me." He looked at her again with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that he seemed to have no defenses against producing when she said something he had not anticipated. "I understand," he said. She gave him one more look to confirm that she believed him, and then she said, "Come to the workshop at 9 o'clock. Bring the sheriff." "Not the sheriff," he said. Clyde Oakes has dinner at the Danvers house twice a month. I will bring a U.S. Marshal from Abilene. I have been waiting for an excuse to call him in." This was another thing she had not anticipated, and it was a good one. "You have been planning for this," she said. "I told you. I have been investigating for 4 months." She left the office. The sky was full purple now, and the first early shopkeepers were beginning to open their shutters, and she walked home through the fresh, cold morning air feeling something she had not felt in years, the sense of moving toward something rather than simply holding everything together against the force of entropy. It was not comfortable, but it was alive. Marshal David Reese arrived from Abilene on the afternoon stage, having been telegraphed by George Barnett at some early hour of that morning. He was a small, methodical man with a gray beard, and a reputation for being difficult to impress and impossible to bribe. Theresa met him at her workshop door, shook his hand, and showed him in without preamble. George was already there, standing with his hat in his hands in the same posture as the day before, except that everything was different now and they both knew it. "The desk," Theresa said, leading them to the roll top, which was locked. "My husband constructed a space in this desk during the last months of his life. I built the desk, so I am the one who knows the mechanism. I would ask you both to stand back while I open it, so that you can see clearly that I am not adding to or removing anything." Marshal Reese raised one eyebrow, glanced at George, and stepped back. George also stepped back, and she caught his eye briefly, and he gave her the smallest nod. She began. The first latch was a false panel on the left side of the tambour housing, which released a pin. The second was the pin's release, which required pressing 2 specific points on the wooden rail simultaneously. The third, fourth, and fifth were inside the desk proper, a series of graduated pressure points disguised as decorative knobs, which when pressed in the correct sequence released the floor of the main drawer by 3 millimeters. The sixth was using that 3-millimeter gap to slide a hidden striker to the left. The 7th through 12th were a 6-point sequential release in the back panel, each one requiring a precise angle and pressure that took years of muscle memory to execute cleanly. She was very aware of the silence behind her as she worked. She did not hurry. Hurrying this mechanism invited error, and she had not made an error with her own work in years. The 13th latch required her to reach under the main body of the desk and press a specific spoke on the frame, which she did without bending to look, purely by touch. The 14th and 15th were the 2 outer frame locks that released simultaneously when you knew to press them together. The 16th was the catch at the back of the secondary floor, which she pressed with the tip of her middle finger in exactly the right spot. The compartment opened like a hand offering something up. The silence behind her was absolute. She turned around. George Barnett was staring at the desk with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, and that she thought she would remember for the rest of her life. It was the expression of a man who has just understood something much larger than he thought he was looking at, a kind of stunned and fully undone admiration that he was making absolutely no effort to conceal. Marshal Reese cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said, "in 30 years of law enforcement, I have never seen anything like that." "The mechanism is a modified Brahma principle," she said, "combined with a sequential pressure release of my own design. It would take someone who didn't know the sequence approximately 6 weeks to open it by trial and error, assuming they had correctly identified all 16 points, which they wouldn't." George Barnett made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more complicated, and then he pressed his lips together and said, "7 documents." "7," she said. She listed them in order exactly as she had told him she would. She told him what each one contained. And then she stepped back and let them come forward and do their work. The arrest of Rafe Danvers happened 2 days later, on a cold Thursday morning, executed by Marshal Reese with George Barnett as his deputy and 3 additional men brought from Abilene for the purpose. Danvers was taken from his house before breakfast. Theresa heard about it from her neighbor Mrs. Calvert, who had heard it from the livery man, who had watched the whole thing from his hayloft. Danvers had apparently shouted a great many things, several of which were threats directed at Theresa by name. She absorbed this information with the particular calm she had developed for absorbing bad news, which was to continue doing what she was doing, which in this case was sanding the legs of a rocking chair, and to think through the implications methodically. Danvers's threats were not abstract. He was a man with money and with men who worked for his money, and even in custody he could cause harm to someone he considered responsible for his downfall. She was that person. She was also a woman alone in a house on the edge of town. George Barnett appeared at her door that evening. "I heard what he said," she told him before he could speak. "I know you did. I want you to know that Marshal Reese has spoken to Danvers's ranch foreman, who has been told very clearly what the consequences of any action against you would be, and I am personally going to—" He stopped. "I would like to stay close, if that is acceptable to you. I am not suggesting that you need protection. I know you don't need protection. I am suggesting that you should not have to deal with the possibility of Danvers's spite alone." She looked at him for a moment. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. He slept in the barn for 4 nights, and on the 5th evening she brought his supper out to him instead of leaving it at the door, and she sat on the hay bale across from him while he ate, and they talked. They talked the way people talk when they have been circling each other for months and have finally allowed themselves to be in the same orbit. They talked about Arthur carefully, not cruelly. She told him some true things about her marriage, the respect without warmth, the absence without cruelty, the sense of having been an admirable piece of a man's life without ever having been the center of it. He listened with the complete attention that was his way, and he did not offer easy comfort or empty consolation, and she was grateful. He told her about his years as a Texas Ranger, the 3 years in the Big Bend country following Comanche raiders across terrain that killed horses and men with equal impartiality, the colleagues he had lost, the particular moral weight of a life spent in violence even on the side of the law. He told her he had left the Rangers because he had needed to live somewhere long enough to know his neighbors. "Do you know them now?" she asked. "Your neighbors?" "Some of them," he said, and he looked at her in a way that made the straightforward sentence into something considerably more specific. She did not respond to that directly. She took his empty plate and went back inside, and she stood in the kitchen for a full minute before her hands were steady enough to wash it. Emmett Cole was released on the same day that Marshal Reese formally charged Rafe Danvers with the murders of Carl Reuter and Emil Schreiber, 2 counts, along with land fraud, bribery of a public official, and conspiracy. The charges rolled through the town of Seraphina's Creek like weather, and the town had to reorganize itself around them, because the Danvers family had been the social architecture of the county for 20 years, and the architecture had just collapsed. Theresa watched this reorganization with the detached attention of someone who has been standing slightly outside the social structure long enough to observe it clearly. She had always been the furniture maker, the widow, the capable woman at the edge of things. Now she was also the woman who had kept Arthur's secret and the woman who had given it up, and people were not entirely sure how to categorize her, which was, in her experience, the most comfortable social position available to a woman in a small western town. Emmett Cole came to see her the day after his release. He was a thin man in his 50s, pale from jail and shaken in a way that had not quite resolved itself yet, and he came to the door of the workshop with his hat turning in his hands and something enormous in his eyes. "I owe you my life," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said. "I owe you an apology for not acting sooner. I am sorry, Mr. Cole." He shook his head slowly. "Arthur tried to do right at the end. That counts for something." "Yes," she said. "I believe it does." He left, and she stood in the door of the workshop and looked down the street at the ordinary life of the town resuming itself, and she felt the particular exhaustion that comes not from exertion but from sustained tension finally releasing. George came to the workshop that afternoon on official business, to follow up on some aspect of the paperwork for the trial, and when the official business was finished, he stayed, standing just inside the door with his hat in his hands as he always did, and they both noticed that neither of them was quite managing to end the visit. "The Schreiber deed," he said finally. "I've been in contact with a lawyer in San Antonio who has located the surviving family. Franz Schreiber, who is 23, and his younger brother Heinrich, who is 19 now. Their mother is alive, remarried, living in San Antonio. The process of restitution will take time, but Marshal Reese has indicated he will press for the return of the land as part of the criminal proceedings against Danvers." She felt the particular relief of something being made right that has been wrong long enough to feel permanent. "Good," she said. "The Cruises and the Abernathys are also being contacted," he said. "There may be civil claims, it's complex." "It should be complex," she said. "Those were people's lives." He looked at her with those eyes. "Yes," he said, "they were." She asked him to stay for supper. She did not soften the asking with qualifications or apologies. She asked plainly, and he accepted plainly, and it was the most natural thing that had happened between them in 8 months of unnatural circumspection. She made a simple supper, the kind of thing that could be assembled from what a practical woman kept in her larder in the autumn of 1882 in West Texas: salt pork and corn, dried beans that had been soaking since morning, biscuits from the oven. The kitchen was warm and smelled of food and wood smoke, and the particular dry warmth of a well-built house. And George Barnett sat at the kitchen table with his jacket over the back of the chair, and his sleeves rolled to his elbows and somehow fit in the kitchen in a way that made the room feel different. She set a plate in front of him and then sat across from him with her own, and she thought, with the part of her mind she tried not to let run unchecked, that she had not eaten across a table from someone in 3 years, and that she had not minded it until right now, and that right now she minded the 3 lost years enormously. "You never remarried," he said. It was said without the prying quality some people gave to this observation. It was said the way he said most things, directly and without manipulation. "No," she said, "I was not in a hurry to give someone else authority over my property and my time." He was quiet for a moment, eating. Then, "That's the law's fault, not the institution's." "It amounts to the same thing when you're living it," she said. "Fair enough." He looked at his plate and then back at her. "What would it take to change your mind?" "Hypothetically." She looked at him steadily. "A man who understood that my intelligence is not a peculiarity to be tolerated, but the most important thing about me. A man who would not attempt to manage or redirect or smooth down the parts of me that are inconvenient. A man who could sit across a table from me without feeling diminished by the fact that I know things he doesn't." Silence. "That's a specific list," he said. "I am a specific person," she said. He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched him think, watched the shift in his expression from consideration to something more settled. "I can't claim to have no ego," he said. "I'd be lying, and you'd know it. But I will tell you this, Mrs. Hawkins, and I want you to take it for what it is, which is the plain truth with nothing added. I have never been more impressed by a person in my professional life than I was watching you open that desk, and I knew already that you were the most remarkable woman I had ever met. Those 2 things together do not diminish me, they do the opposite." She held very still, because she was not accustomed to being described in those terms by anyone, least of all by a man who had no obvious agenda in offering them. "That is a very fine thing to say," she told him. "I mean it." "I know you do," she said. "That's what makes it fine." They finished supper. He helped her clear the table, which she had not expected, and the domesticity of it was almost unbearably tender, the 2 of them moving around the small kitchen with the unconscious choreography of people who are somehow already familiar with each other's movements. She washed the plates. He dried them and handed them back to her one at a time without being asked where to put them, watching her put them away and learning the kitchen that way. When it was done, he put on his jacket and collected his hat from the peg by the door, and he stood there for a moment with it in his hands. "I would like to come to supper again," he said, "if that would be acceptable." "Wednesday," she said. He came Wednesday, and the Wednesday after, and the Wednesday after that. What grew between them in those weeks was not the sudden combustion of two people swept away by feeling, because they were not those kinds of people, but something better, which was the slow and unmistakable recognition of two people who are, against all prior expectation, home. They were both too intelligent and too self-aware for the process to be painless. They had both spent years constructing careful distances from others and from their own wanting, and dismantling those constructions was not comfortable, but it was inescapable. He told her about his family in Kentucky, a father who had worked a farm until it killed him, and a mother who had raised 6 children with the concentrated intensity of someone who knew the world was hostile and was determined to send her children into it ready. He had come to Texas at 17 with his older brother because Kentucky had nothing left in it for them. His brother had gone back. He had not. She told him about her own mother, a school teacher in Virginia who had given her daughters an education that was not conventional for the time and place, who had told them regularly that their minds were the one thing no one could take from them. She told him about the specific loneliness of being intelligent in a place and time that considered female intelligence an eccentricity, and he listened with the full attention she was beginning to understand was one of his most fundamental qualities, the ability to actually receive what you were telling him rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "When I was 22, she said, on an evening in late October when the wood stove was burning and the wind was coming down from the north, I spent 3 weeks designing a mechanism for a cabinet lock that I could not resolve. I had the design in my head, and I could not make the physical reality match it. It was like having a word you cannot remember but cannot stop trying to remember. I thought about it constantly. Did you solve it? Eventually. It took me 3 weeks and a great deal of wasted wood. When I finally got it right, I sat in the workshop for a long time and I felt, for the first time in my life, that my intelligence was not a problem to be managed but a tool I had just learned to use." He looked at her in the firelight for a long, quiet moment. "Did Arthur know about that moment?" "No," she said. "I'm glad you told me," he said. The trial of Rafe Danvers began in Abilene in November, presided over by a federal judge brought in from Austin, and it was the kind of trial that drew reporters from 3 different Texas newspapers, and at least one from as far away as Dallas. Theresa attended as a witness. She sat in the witness box in the best dress she owned, a dark green wool with practical buttons and no unnecessary frills, and she answered every question put to her with precise accuracy and no visible emotion. She was cross-examined by Danvers's lawyer for 90 minutes. It was an aggressive examination, designed to undermine her credibility by implying that a widow of modest standing with a complicated inheritance had invented or embellished evidence to protect her own interests. She answered every question with the same measured specificity she brought to everything, citing exact dates, exact dimensions, exact sequences, correcting his mischaracterizations of the evidence with a courtroom patience that made the attorney increasingly frustrated and the judge increasingly attentive. At one point the attorney said, with a condescension that was intended to dismiss her, "Mrs. Hawkins, isn't it true that you cannot verify the provenance of these documents independently, as the man who allegedly wrote them is dead?" "The handwriting has been verified by 3 independent experts," she said. "The paper stock has been dated to the period in question by the paper merchant in San Antonio who supplied it to my husband, whose records are in evidence. The ink composition is consistent with the ink my husband used, which I personally purchased from the general store in Seraphina's Creek, and whose records are also in evidence. I built the compartment in which these documents were hidden, and I can describe its construction in exhaustive technical detail, which would require extraordinary foreknowledge for anyone attempting to fabricate the story of its discovery. And finally, the land deed itself, with the Schraber name on it, is a public document that predates my husband's death by 12 years, and which Rafe Danvers has not explained to this court's satisfaction. The courtroom was quiet. "I think," said the judge, "that the witness has answered the question." George sat in the front row of the public gallery throughout the examination, and she did not allow herself to look at him, but she was aware of him with the heightened awareness she had developed for his presence over the preceding weeks, and she knew from the quality of the silence in that direction that he was watching her with the expression she had first seen when the desk opened. Rafe Danvers was found guilty on both counts of murder and on the fraud charges 18 days later. The sentence was death by hanging for the murders, commuted to life imprisonment on appeal, a process that took years and resulted in Danvers dying in prison in 1889 without ever having set foot on the North Range again. The restitution for the land fraud was ongoing and complex, as George had predicted, but Franz Schraber came to Serafina's Creek in the spring of 1883 and stood on his family's land for the first time since he was a boy of 11, and Theresa Hawkins watched from the fence with her eyes stinging, and she was not ashamed of it. The evening after the verdict was delivered, George came to her workshop. It was late past supper and the oil lamp was burning, and she was doing the thing she did when she was processing large feelings, which was work, planing the edge of a board with long, slow strokes that required her full attention. He knocked. She said, "Come in." He came in. He stood just inside the door for a moment. Then he said, "Theresa," not Mrs. Hawkins, her name with nothing attached to it. She set the plane down and looked at him. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I am not a man who is good at the circumspect approach, as you may have noticed." "I have noticed," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I expect you know this. I expect you've known it for some time because you know most things before other people do. I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I just needed you to know that I have said it out loud at least once, so it is on the record between us." She stood very still for a moment. The lamp's flame moved in some draft she couldn't identify. "It is on the record," she said. He nodded. He started to put his hat back on. "George." He stopped. "I am also in love with you," she said. "I expect you know this too, because you are a better observer than you give yourself credit for. I have also not asked you for anything, but since we are putting things on the record, I thought I should add that." He stood there with his hat in his hand and that stunned, undone expression on his face that she was now entirely certain she could not live without seeing regularly. And then he crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, and he put his free hand along the side of her face with the care of someone holding something irreplaceable, and he said, very quietly, "All right then." "All right," she said. He kissed her. It was not the tentative, questioning kiss of someone uncertain of his welcome. It was the kiss of a man who had been paying close attention for 8 months and knew exactly what he was doing. She was not a woman who was easily undone, and she was, for a moment, entirely undone. They stood in the workshop with the lamp burning and the smell of sawdust around them, and she let herself press her forehead against his shoulder briefly, just briefly, and he put his arm around her and kept it there. And the thing that she had been holding at arm's length for years, the possibility of someone who was her equal, her match, her person, settled around her like warmth. He proposed to her on a Saturday afternoon in December, standing in the cold outside the workshop with his breath making clouds in the air. And he did it the way she had somehow known he would, directly and without elaborate ceremony, because elaborate ceremony was not his nature any more than it was hers. "I would like very much to marry you," he said. "I want you to understand that I am not asking you to change anything about your life or your work. I will move into this house, because yours is the better house and the better workshop, and I will be useful wherever I can be, and I will never in my life attempt to tell you what to do with your furniture business. What I am offering is myself, George Barnett, in the unimpressive entirety of my actual self, and my complete and permanent admiration of you." She looked at him for a long moment. The cold was very clean, and the sky above the hills was a pale winter blue that went on forever. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, and it was such an honest, relieved exhale that she laughed, and he smiled at her, and it was the first real smile she had seen from him, all the way in his eyes, and it made him look 10 years younger and completely different from the controlled, composed professional she had spent 8 months being careful around. "You were nervous," she said. "I was absolutely terrified," he said. "You are the most capable person I know, and I just asked you to take on an additional responsibility." She laughed again. It was a good laugh, the kind she had not produced often enough over the years, full and genuine and entirely uncalculated. They were married in February of 1883 in the First Methodist Church in Seraphina's Creek, in a ceremony that was small by intention and attended mostly by people who had watched the two of them circle each other for months and were collectively relieved that the circling was over. Emmett Cole was there, thin but recovering. Mrs. Calvert was there with her daughter. Samuel Bright attended, though there had been a necessary and frank conversation between him and Theresa about his role in the Danvers business, a conversation that had ended in mutual understanding and the quiet agreement that a town needed its lawyer to be trustworthy going forward. Sheriff Oakes attended. Marshal Reese sent a letter, which was read aloud and was more affectionate than any of them would have expected from the laconic marshal. Theresa wore a dress she had not made herself, which was unusual. She had bought it in San Antonio during a supply run in January, a deep ivory wool with small pearl buttons, and she had looked at herself in the mirror in the shop with the frank assessment she brought to everything, and decided that she looked like herself, and that this was sufficient. George looked at her when she walked into the church, and the expression on his face was the third variation of the look she had catalogued, different from the desk, different from the verdict, which was simply and wholly love with nothing complicated in it, just the clear, unguarded fact of it. She took his hand at the altar. His hand was warm and rough and steady. The minister read the words that had been read in that same church many times before, the promises of partnership and faithfulness and mutual care, and Theresa heard them differently than she had heard them 12 years earlier, not as a formal recitation of obligations, but as a description of something she actually intended to do with this specific man for the rest of her actual life. "I do," she said, and she meant every syllable. They held a modest dinner afterward at the hotel, paid for in part by an arrangement Theresa had made with the hotel owner, who had been trying for 2 years to commission a particular kind of display case from her, and had never quite been able to afford it. She accepted the dinner as partial payment and promised the case by June. George had found this arrangement entirely characteristic and entirely wonderful. Life settled into a new configuration that spring. George moved into the Hawkins house, as he had said he would. He was an orderly man, which suited her, and he was good with tools in the practical rather than the artistic sense, which meant he was useful for the household maintenance that had always been a competing claim on her time. He had a habit of reading in the evenings, his coat off and his sleeves rolled back, usually something historical or scientific, and she had a habit of sketching furniture designs in the same hours, and they sat across the same table doing their separate things in the same companionable space, and it was the specific form of intimacy that suited them best. He continued his work as deputy. She continued her workshop. She took on an apprentice in the spring of 1883, a young woman named Clara Petty, who was the 17-year-old daughter of the blacksmith, and who had the same quality of focus that Theresa recognized from her own earliest encounters with wood and tools. Clara was quick and gifted and entirely unsentimental about her gift, which Theresa approved of. "You're teaching her the hidden compartment techniques," George asked one evening with the mildly careful tone that meant he had an opinion about it that he was not imposing. "Yes," said Theresa. A pause. "Good," he said. She looked at him. "Women should know where to hide things," he said, "and how to keep them hidden until they choose to reveal them." She set down her pencil and looked at him with something that was warm and specific and very private. "You are unexpectedly enlightened for your era," she said. "I have had an enlightening influence in my life recently," he said, without looking up from his book. She threw a wood chip at him. He caught it without looking up, which was its own form of showing off, and she found this so entirely characteristic that she had to look back at her drawings before her face did something she'd prefer to control. Franz Schreiber visited Serafina's Creek again in the summer of 1883, this time with his younger brother Heinrich, to begin the process of working the land that was being returned to their family. The process was still entangled in legal proceedings, but Marshal Reese had arranged for temporary cultivation rights while the courts worked through the formal restitution. Franz was a serious young man with his father's eyes, and something careful about his manner that told the story of a childhood disrupted. He came to thank Theresa directly, which he did with a formality that was not cool, but was the formality of someone who had a great deal of feeling and was keeping most of it managed. She told him what she had not told many people, that Arthur had tried to make it right at the end, that the confession had been Arthur's own act of conscience, imperfect and late but real. She told him because she thought he deserved to know that the man who had been party to his father's destruction had not gone to his death without remorse. She did not know whether this mattered to Franz Schreiber. She thought it might someday. He shook her hand and thanked her again, and then he and Heinrich went to look at their land, and Theresa watched them go, and she was aware that something that had been wrong for a long time was in the slow and imperfect but real process of being made right. George was at her side. He had come to stand next to her without announcement, which he did when he thought she might need the company without being a person who would ask for it. She did need it. She did not say so, but she moved slightly so their shoulders were touching, and he let his hand find hers, and they stood that way until the Schreiber brothers disappeared around the bend in the road. The autumn of 1883 brought two things of note. The first was the completion of the commission that Theresa had been working toward since before the Danvers affair, a full library installation for a wealthy rancher in an adjacent county named Harlan Pool, who had heard of her work and ridden 3 days to commission it. The library was the most ambitious project she had ever undertaken. 3 full walls of floor-to-ceiling cabinetry with a rolling ladder, 7 different types of wood, and a series of hidden compartments that Theresa designed as a private pleasure, knowing that Harlan Pool would never find them but that she would know they were there. She spent 6 weeks on the installation, driving out to the Pool ranch 4 days a week and returning home in the evenings. George fed himself adequately in her absence, mostly through the good offices of the hotel dining room and a practical approach to dried beans that she had taught him, and he did not suggest that the commission was too demanding or that she was away too much, because he was not that kind of man. But she noticed that he was reading when she came in on the evenings she returned, rather than already in bed, and she understood this as the form of waiting that he was willing to admit to. The second thing of note was that she was pregnant. She had suspected it for 3 weeks before she confirmed it to herself, and she spent 2 more days after that deciding how she felt about it, which was necessary, because she was a person who needed to have her own reaction to things before she was ready to present them to another person, even George. She told him on an evening in October when the first serious cold had come down, and she had built the fire up and they were in the sitting room together, her with her drawings, him with his book. She set down her pencil. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked up with the full attention. "I am expecting a child," she said. "I believe sometime in March or April." He was very still for a moment. Then the full sunlight smile appeared, the one that made him look 10 years younger, and then he set his book down and crossed to her side of the table and crouched beside her chair. "Theresa," he said, in the voice she had first heard at 5:30 in the morning in the sheriff's office, the one that was almost relief. "Yes," she said. He took both her hands in his carefully as if she were something he might damage, and she said, "I am not made of china, George. I am made of much tougher material." "I know," he said. "I know exactly what you're made of." He kissed her hands and then her forehead, and then he sat down on the floor beside her chair and leaned his head against her knee, which was such an unguarded thing for this controlled, composed man to do that she felt it in her chest like something unlocking. She put her hand in his hair. The fire was burning. The wind was outside. The baby was born in March of 1884, as predicted, in the bedroom of the house that had been Arthur's and was now hers and George's, attended by Mrs. Calvert, who had practical midwifery experience, and Dr. Hennessy, who was Seraphina's Creek's only physician and a careful and competent man. The labor was long but manageable, and Theresa approached it the way she approached all technically demanding tasks, with complete focus and without complaint about the difficulty of the process, though the difficulty was considerable. George spent the labor in the kitchen and the sitting room alternately, unable to be still, and Mrs. Calvert reported to him at intervals with the professional calm of someone who had done this many times. Dr. Hennessy emerged at intervals to confirm that things were progressing normally. At 2 in the morning, Arthur James Barnett came into the world with a substantial amount of noise, which Theresa considered a good sign, and was placed in his father's arms approximately 4 minutes later. George Barnett stood in the bedroom doorway holding a son who would grow to be a carpenter and a justice of the peace, and his face was the fourth version of the expression she had catalogued, which was entirely new and had no antecedent in anything she had seen before, a kind of wonder so complete it made him look simultaneously older and younger, as if he were seeing everything from the beginning. "Arthur," she said from the bed. "Arthur," he said. "For the man he tried to become at the end," she said. George looked at her across the room over the head of the child, and she saw in his face the fullness of what she was to him, which was everything, which was understood, which was chosen, every day, not by default or by circumstance, but by the specific and renewed decision of a man who knew exactly what he was choosing. "Arthur James Barnett," he said. "That is a fine name." Clara Petty, the apprentice, came to the house 3 days after the baby was born and announced that she had a question about the design of a particular joint and could not wait for Mrs. Barnett to return to the workshop. Theresa, sitting up in bed with the baby asleep beside her, answered the question thoroughly and accurately and then said, "Come back Friday and we will look at it together. I will be up by then." "You cannot possibly be up by Friday," said Clara. "Watch me," said Theresa. She was up by Friday. She did not push herself dangerously, because she was not reckless, but she was not a woman who stayed down when she could be upright. And by the 2nd week of April she was back in the workshop for half-days, with Arthur in a basket near the wood stove that George had padded and positioned in 3 different configurations, until she told him it was fine. George came at noon every day to eat with her in the workshop. He would sit on the hay bale that had migrated from the barn and eat whatever he had brought from home or from the hotel, and he would talk to her about his morning, and she would talk to him about her work, and Arthur would sleep in the basket or not sleep and periodically make his opinions about this known. And it was a life so different from what she had expected that she sometimes held very still in the middle of it, and took stock of it with the deliberate attention of someone who knows that good things require deliberate acknowledgement to be fully received. The workshop expanded in 1885. Theresa hired a second assistant, a young man named Thomas Berg, who had come to Seraphina's Creek from Kansas, with skills in metalwork that were more refined than anyone else in the county, and who proved invaluable for the hardware components of her increasingly complex commissions. Clara had mastered most of the basic joinery by then, and was beginning to develop her own design sensibility, and the workshop was becoming something Theresa had not quite planned but was genuinely pleased by, a place where excellent work was being made by people who had learned that excellent work was the point. George was promoted to sheriff in the autumn of 1885, when Clyde Oakes retired to his sister's farm in the hill country. The promotion was unopposed, which said something both about the town's trust in him and about the memory of the Danvers affair, which had established George's reputation for the particular combination of methodical investigation and personal integrity that a county needed in its chief law officer. He accepted the promotion with his characteristic lack of ceremony and quietly doubled his efforts at paperwork management, which had never been his favorite part of the work. Their second child, a girl they named Margaret Eleanor Barnett, arrived in the summer of 1886 and was from the beginning entirely different from her brother, watchful and quiet where Arthur had been noisy and expressive, with her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, and an apparent interest from a very young age in anything with a mechanism, a tendency that George observed with delight and that Theresa observed with recognition. "She is going to be trouble," George said one evening, watching 18-month-old Margaret systematically dismantle the clasp on Theresa's sewing basket with a concentration that was not playful but entirely focused. "She is going to be extraordinary," Theresa said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said. "No," she agreed. "In my experience, they are generally the same thing." He laughed, and she leaned against his shoulder, and the evenings had become the best part of her days, not because the days were not good they were, but because the evenings had this specific quality of fullness, the whole complicated life of the day gathered up and set down and appreciated. She told him about her mother in a series of conversations over many evenings, filling in the picture of where she had come from, and he listened the way he always listened, with the attention that received rather than collected. He told her about the brother who had gone back to Kentucky, who wrote sometimes, whose letters George answered with the careful formality of someone who maintains a relationship, because it was a relationship, and not because the daily texture of it is easy. She understood this. She wrote to her own sister in Virginia twice a year with the same combination of genuine affection and managed distance. In the spring of 1887, she received a letter from Franz Schreiber. The legal process had finally resolved. The North Range was fully theirs. He and Heinrich had built a house on the land, and their mother had come up from San Antonio and was living with them, and they were running cattle, not many, but enough. He wrote to thank her again, and to say that his mother wanted her to know that the Schreiber family considered what she had done a debt that could not be repaid but would be remembered. She read the letter to George at supper, and neither of them spoke for a moment when it was done. "There is a family on that land because you acted," he said. "There is a family on that land because Arthur finally told the truth and because you were already looking for it," she said. "It was a combined effort." "You are very generous," he said. "I am accurate," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand briefly and released it and went back to his supper, and that was enough. The workshop that year was at full capacity. Theresa had refined her hidden compartment work to a point where she was receiving commissions specifically for that feature from buyers who had heard of the Danvers desk through the talk that a trial generates. She was selective about these commissions. She declined to work for anyone whose reasons for wanting hidden spaces seemed to involve hiding things from the law, and she accepted work for anyone who seemed to want what she had originally wanted, a private space in a world that frequently did not respect privacy. Banks, lawyers with genuine confidential document needs, women who needed somewhere to keep things safe from circumstances that the law was slow to address. She taught Clara the full mechanism of the sequential lock before Clara married Thomas Berg in the fall of 1887, and the two of them set up their own complementary workshop 2 streets over, which Theresa had anticipated and prepared for by establishing a formal partnership arrangement that preserved the working relationship while acknowledging Clara's independence. George had reviewed the partnership document with his practical eye for logical structure and said it was the most sensible business document he had seen in the county. Arthur, age 3, had become a fixture in the workshop in the way that children become fixtures in the workplaces of working parents, which is to say, he was underfoot and tolerated and occasionally useful. He had his mother's capacity for concentration when something interested him and his father's capacity for patience, and he showed an early inclination for the purely structural rather than the decorative aspects of furniture, for how things held together rather than how they appeared. Margaret, by contrast, had her mother's interest in mechanisms but paired it with a design sensibility that seemed to arrive from nowhere in particular, an eye for proportion and beauty that expressed itself first in her toys and then, when she was given small pieces of wood and a blunt chisel at age 4, in the pieces she made, which were simple but unmistakably considered. "She gets that from you," George said. "She might get it from her grandmother," Theresa said. "My mother had an excellent eye." "I think she gets it from watching you," George said, "every day." Theresa looked at him. There were times when he said things that were so simply and precisely true that she had no response for them. "Perhaps," she said, "the town of Seraphina's Creek in the later 1880s was changing, as every Texas town was changing in that period. The railroad had not come through Seraphina's Creek, but had come within 12 miles of it, and the effect on commerce was significant, goods arriving faster and in greater quantity, prices shifting, new settlers coming in from the east with expectations that were shaped by places with more infrastructure and more convenience than a West Texas town had previously needed to provide. George had his work cut out managing a population that was growing faster than his office could easily handle, and he hired 2 additional deputies and spent a significant amount of time in the late 1880s dealing with the particular kind of trouble that came with rapid growth, disputes over water rights, claim jumping, the ordinary social friction of people who did not yet know their neighbors well enough to trust them. Theresa had her own relationship with the changing town. More business, more commissions, more materials available from the improved supply chains, but also more competition from manufactured furniture coming in by rail, mass-produced pieces that were inferior to her work but much cheaper. She addressed this by moving resolutely upmarket and by being very clear about what she offered that no factory could provide, which was a piece of furniture that had been thought through by a specific human intelligence and built by specific human hands for a specific human need. Her clients self-selected accordingly. In 1889, the year Rafe Danvers died in prison, Theresa built a desk for the county courthouse in the next county over, a commission that had come to her specifically because of the reputation of the Danvers desk and the court proceedings that had made it famous in a regional way. She built it with 17 latches, one more than the desk that had changed her life, and she built it for the circuit judge who was going to use it, a woman of 55 named Judge Constance Mora, who had been appointed to the position by a governor who had apparently run out of acceptable male candidates, and had made what he considered a temporary appointment that had lasted 8 years, because Judge Mora was so manifestly good at her job that removing her was impossible. Theresa spent a week installing the desk, staying at the hotel in the county seat, and she and Judge Mora had several conversations over that week that she filed in the category of conversations she would remember for the rest of her life. A woman who had made herself indispensable in a system that had not been built for her, by being too excellent to dismiss. "The secret," said Judge Mora on an evening when they were drinking coffee in her chambers, "is not to fight the structure directly. You work with its logic until you have demonstrated that your logic is better, and then the structure must accommodate you, because to exclude you would be visibly irrational." "I have been using that approach for 20 years, Theresa said, "in a different context." "I know," said Judge Mora. "I've heard about your desk." She came home from that week to George, who was standing on the porch in the evening light watching for her down the road, which he did not know she could see from the bend before the house came into view. She always slowed her horse slightly at that bend to give herself a moment with the sight of him, the particular set of his shoulders, and the way he held himself when he was just being, not composing himself for anyone else, and the fact of his waiting. She came up the path and he came down the porch steps, and she handed him the reins without speaking, and he tied the horse without speaking, and then they went inside where Arthur and Margaret were already in bed and the house was quiet, and she sat down at the kitchen table and he put the kettle on. "Good week," he said. "Very good week," she said. "I met a remarkable woman." "Tell me," he said. She told him everything and he listened, and that was the shape of their life. Their third child came in the summer of 1890, when Theresa was 38 and had decided, with her characteristic pragmatism, that this would very probably be the last. She was not wrong. William Henry Barnett arrived on a hot July morning with somewhat less drama than his siblings and a quality of contentment that distinguished him from the beginning. He was the child who slept well and ate well and was pleased with the world, and he grew into a man who was similarly inclined, which was its own kind of gift. George, at the birth of his third child, held the boy with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before and said, "William," trying it out. "Will." "Yes." "He looks like your brother," said Theresa. George looked at her. He had shown her a photograph of his brother once, a daguerreotype from Kentucky that was 15 years old. "He does," said George. He was quiet for a moment. "I will write to Daniel tonight." He did write to Daniel that night, and the letter that came back 3 weeks later was warmer than the usual careful formality they had maintained, and the correspondence between George and his brother improved noticeably after that and stayed improved. Arthur James Barnett, age 6, was allowed to hold his new brother briefly and with great supervision, and handled this responsibility with the seriousness of someone who understood that things worth holding required careful attention. He would grow up to be a justice of the peace in Seraphina's Creek, a man respected for his methodical fairness and his ability to find the structural solution in any dispute. He would also build furniture, never with his mother's genius but with genuine competence, and he would commission pieces from his mother's workshop throughout his adult life. Margaret Eleanor Barnett grew up to be a furniture designer who never made a piece herself but whose designs were executed by workshops in 3 states. She learned to draw her ideas with a precision that could be handed directly to a craftsperson without modification, and she had the additional inheritance of knowing exactly how each mechanism worked, because her mother had taught her every latch and every joint and every sequential lock she knew, and knowledge like that is not diminished by being shared. William Henry Barnett became a doctor. Nobody had seen this coming, but looking back it made a certain sense, because he had the same quality his mother had, the ability to understand systems from the inside and to work with them rather than against them. In the summer of 1892, Seraphina's Creek held its 30th anniversary celebration, which the town had officially organized to mark its founding, but which also served as the occasion for several other commemorations, including the unveiling of a plaque at the courthouse acknowledging the resolution of the Danvers affair and the restitution of the Schreiber land. It was a small ceremony, intentionally small, because the people involved had generally preferred that things be done rather than celebrated, but it happened, and the Schreiber family was there, Franz and Heinrich and their mother Elsa, older now, a small woman with white hair and Emil Schreiber's eyes in her sons' faces. Elsa Schreiber took Theresa's hands at the ceremony with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a small, elderly woman, and said something in German that Franz translated as, "You gave us back what was ours. That is a rare thing and we will not forget it." "Your husband died for his land," Theresa said. "The least the law could do was return it to his family." George stood beside her, and she was aware of his warmth and his steadiness in the way she was always aware of it now, not as something external, but as something that had become structural, part of the architecture of how she moved through her days. That evening, after the children were in bed, they sat together on the porch in the cooling summer dark, the way they had begun to do on summer evenings, and they were quiet for a long time in the way that people are quiet who have enough between them that silence is not empty. 10 years, George said. "Almost," she said. 9 years and some months. I will round up." She smiled into the dark. "You are not generally a man who rounds up. I am making an exception for the occasion." She looked at his profile in the dusk, the familiar lines of his face, the gray that had overtaken most of the dark at his temples now, the hands that were more scarred than ever from 9 more years of the work he did. She thought about the woman she had been when she had walked into his office at 5:30 in the morning, with conditions she had spent the night designing, and she thought about the woman she was now, and the things that had changed and the things that had not. She was still fiercely private. Still found her deepest self in the workshop. Still designed in her head before her hands touched wood. Still solved problems with a combination of theoretical and practical intelligence that was hers alone. Still kept certain things to herself until she was ready to share them, because that was her nature, and he had never once asked her to change it. What had changed was the particular solitude that had been such a constant of her adult life, the sense of carrying everything alone, not by necessity but because there was no one equipped to help carry it. She was not carrying anything alone now. She had not been for 9 years. "I have been thinking," she said, "about expanding the workshop." He waited. "Not for production, for teaching. Clara and Thomas have their own work, and I am not suggesting competing with them. But there are women in this county who have the same quality I had at 19, a particular kind of attention that is looking for something to do. I want to find them and give them the tools, literally and otherwise." He was quiet for a moment. "What would you need? A larger space, a better kiln situation, more tools of the intermediate range, patience, which I have, time, which is negotiable." "You have been doing this already," he said, "with Clara, with the girls she has referred to you, on an informal basis. I want to formalize it." "Then formalize it," he said. "What do you need me to do?" She looked at him. "Nothing," she said. "I just needed to tell you." "All right," he said. She reached across the gap between the 2 porch chairs and found his hand and held it, and the summer night was warm and full of the sounds of a town that was still alive, still working, still becoming whatever it was going to become. The workshop expansion happened in 1893, and it changed Theresa's life in ways she had not entirely anticipated, because the women who came were not just looking for furniture skills. They were looking for what she had found in that first long, silent workshop solitude, the knowledge that their intelligence had a shape and a practice and a product. She taught joinery and design and mechanism and measurement, and the particular discipline of making something that would last longer than you would. She was not sentimental about it. She taught the way she did everything else, directly and with high expectations and without condescension. George would occasionally stop in the doorway of the expanded workshop and look at the scene inside, 4 or 5 women at workbenches, sawdust in the air, the sound of work, and he would have the expression on his face that was private and warm and entirely his own, and Theresa would look up and catch it, and they would share a moment that needed no words. She was 41. He was 45. They were, as far as either of them was capable of assessing their own situation, entirely happy. The happiness was not uncomplicated. Happiness rarely is, and they were not people who needed it to be. George's work brought him regularly into contact with the worst of what people did to each other, and he carried this weight with the stoicism that was his nature but that she had learned to read. The evenings when he was quieter than usual, the nights when he was restless. She did not attempt to talk him out of these moods. She made sure the fire was going and put his book where he could find it and was present without pressing, and mostly this was enough. Her own complicated weather came from the workshop, from commissions that went wrong, from the physical fatigue that accumulated in the hands and shoulders and back of someone who had been doing precise physical work for 2 decades. From the occasional visitor to the workshop who was rude or dismissive or both, and who required her to be entirely composed in response. These things she brought back to the house and mostly resolved in the quiet of the evening, and George's habit of steady presence was the most useful possible environment for this kind of resolution. They fought sometimes. Not often and not badly, but they were both people with strong opinions and certain convictions about how things ought to be done, and occasionally these convictions collided. Their arguments tended to be thorough and logical, and resolved by one or both of them being persuaded by the other's argument, which was the kind of fighting that is actually a form of respect. Neither of them held grudges. Neither of them deployed silence as a weapon. These were among the things that made the marriage work. In the autumn of 1895, Arthur turned 11 and began to show a specific interest in law and in how the structures of county administration worked, which George observed with the careful neutrality of a father who is very pleased but does not want to press. He began bringing Arthur to the office on Saturday mornings, not as a teaching exercise, but simply as a thing they did, and Arthur sat in the corner and watched and absorbed with the focused attention that was unmistakably his mother's. Margaret, 9 years old, had already produced 12 furniture designs in her sketchbook, none of which she had attempted to build, but all of which Theresa had assessed carefully and privately found to be better than most working designers produced. She told Margaret this directly, and Margaret received it with the particular combination of pleasure and determination that meant she was filing it away as something to live up to rather than resting on it. William, 5 years old, had taken to following Dr. Hennessy around town on his rounds with a persistence that the doctor found more amusing than bothersome, and the doctor had begun answering his questions with the seriousness they deserved, which Theresa thought spoke very well of Dr. Hennessy. On an evening in December of 1895, with the children in bed and the house quiet and the wood stove burning and the usual small domestic sounds of the night around them, George looked up from his book and said, "Theresa." She looked up from her drawings. "I want to tell you something," he said. "I have been trying to find the right way to say it for some time, so it may not come out perfectly, but I want you to know what I am attempting to say." She set her pencil down and gave him her full attention. "The morning I woke up, and you had been gone 4 nights in the workshop during the first year," he said. "After Rafe Danvers had been arrested, I sat in this kitchen and I thought about what it would be like if you were not here. And I understood in that moment that the best possible thing that had happened to me in my life was that you had put conditions on a conversation and refused to be moved, and that I had been given the extraordinary specific luck of being in the position to meet those conditions. I have not said this clearly before. I wanted to say it clearly." She looked at him for a long time. "That was the morning," she said, "I walked into your office before sunrise." "Yes," he said. "I was so afraid," she said. "I did not show it, but I was very afraid that you would be the kind of man who couldn't hear conditions from a woman, and so I would have to do this alone." "You would have found a way," he said. "Probably," she said, "but I am very glad I did not have to." He put his book down. She came from her chair to his and sat beside him on the wide seat, which was not ideally designed for 2 adults, but was manageable if both adults were willing to be close, which they were. She put her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The wood stove ticked. "George," she said. "Yes, we did a good thing with the desk, with all of it." "Yes," he said, "we did. I built 16 latches," she said. "I did not know when I built them that the right person would come along eventually who was worth opening them for." He was quiet for a moment. She felt his chest rise and fall. "I didn't know either," he said, "but I am glad I came around and kept asking." "You were very persistent," she said. "I am very persistent," he agreed without apology. "I know," she said. "It is one of your better qualities." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she closed her eyes, and the fire burned, and the house that had been Arthur's and had been hers and was now entirely theirs, built up over 12 years of this particular life they had made together, was warm around them, and it held them the way good houses hold the people inside them, which is to say structurally, with intention, with the care of something built to last. The drawer of the workshop desk still existed. She had never removed the compartment. She had not seen any reason to dismantle a piece of good mechanism simply because it was no longer in use, but she had told George where every latch was, all 16 of them. She had walked him through the sequence on a quiet Sunday afternoon, standing in the workshop while Arthur napped and Margaret drew, and the light came through the high windows. He had tried it himself afterward, her hand guiding his through the sequence, 12 failed attempts before the muscle memory began to form, And when the compartment finally opened under his hands, he had the expression of someone who has just been given access to something precious and knows it. "I will keep practicing," he said. "You will get it," she said. He had gotten it, eventually. It had taken him 3 weeks of occasional practice before he could do it cleanly and without her guidance. She had watched the time he did it in the correct sequence in a smooth, uninterrupted flow, and she had not said anything at all. He had turned around and seen her expression. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Theresa." "It is well done," she said. "That is all." He had looked at her for a moment, and then he had said, "It is the most demanding mechanism I have ever encountered, and it still does not fully account for how extraordinary it was to watch you do it the first time." She had said nothing to this. She had picked up her tools and gone back to work, and he had stayed in the workshop for a while longer than he needed to, and that had been enough. In the late years, when the children were grown and the workshop had taught a generation of women their trades, and the town had changed and changed again around them, there were mornings when she would walk into the workshop before everyone else was up and stand in the early light with the smell of wood and oil and memory. And she would put her hands on the desk, the original desk, the one she had built, and that had held Arthur's secrets, and that had opened the compartment of her whole second life. She would press the first latch just to feel it give. And then she would hear the back door of the house and George's step in the yard, and she would hear him come to the workshop door, and she would not turn around because she did not need to, because she knew the sound of him as well as she knew the grain of any wood she had ever worked with, as well as she knew the sequence of any lock she had ever built, and he would come in and he would put his hands on her shoulders and look over her head at the desk. "Come have breakfast," he would say. And she would take her hands off the desk, and they would go back inside, into the light and the warmth of the life they had built with their respective and combined capabilities. And the desk would stand in the workshop with its 16 latches all in place, closed now, as closed as anything Theresa Hawkins Barnett had ever built, which was to say perfectly and with great love.